Here at McConnell Springs. The guest speaker tonight is none other than Wes Francis, speaking at the Shelby family estates. Got a really good turnout and a raffle.
To begin, my interest in the Shelbys and their houses stems from my family's ownership of Richland Farm. Richland was the second house built by General James Shelby in Fayette County of that name. My grandparents, Arthur and Ruth Francis, acquired Richland Farm in 1970. They were simply looking to purchase a farm, not realizing the historical or architectural significance of the building which the farm took its name, nor the deep fascination which I would develop with the property over 5 decades later. Growing up, Richland was simply my grandfather's home. While I always enjoyed our visits, I did not realize the historical or architectural significance. The only historical bits of information that we had prior to my research was that the house had been built by General James Shelby, who was some relation to Governor Isaac Shelby, and that my family had purchased the property from the family of Newport land. Everything I'm about to share with you stems from those 2 small pieces of information. But before we get going, I'd like to extend a thank you to Sue and Peter and everyone here in McConnell Springs for having me. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Dr. James Birchfield and Dr. Patrick Snaden for all the assistance they gave me in helping me putting this all together. And I'd like to say thank you to Brooklyn up here for helping me make the slideshow all pretty. But the Shelbys were an early and prominent Kentucky family who held large amounts of land, wealth, and influence. Throughout their family tree, many members occupied significant governmental, militia, educational, and judicial positions. Among their ranks were generals, majors, colonels, mayors, authors, numerous judges and lawyers, and 1 2-term governor. The family's most notable claim to fame is its descent from Governor Isaac Shelby, twice governor of Kentucky and celebrated as a hero of 3 wars. Celebrated as the hero of Kings Mountain during the American Revolution, and a hero once again during the Battle of Thames over 3 decades later during the War of 1812. For his service in the War of 1812, Congress ordered the minting of a gold medal in his honor. And throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the Shelby name is preserved in Shelby County and the town of Shelbyville, as well as numerous streets and parks, which further help cement the Shelby family's enduring legacy. This evening, I will walk you through the early acquisitions of the tracts of land which Governor Shelby owned. The Shelby family in Fayette County traced their lineage and distinction directly to Governor Isaac Shelby. The numerous land grants he acquired enabled him to settle his children on vast tracts of land and amass extraordinary wealth. Wealth built on the backs of enslaved laborers who lived alongside the Shelbys in stark contrast to the affluent lives they enjoyed. This evening, I will walk you through the early acquisition of these tracts by the Shelbys and the expansion that followed. We'll explore how these lands facilitated the accumulation of generational wealth and enabled the construction of 6 mansions upon their Fayette County holdings, the prominent architects employed, the dramatic social history of the Shelby family, and the ultimate loss of their estates and the lengths that some family members went to hold on to them. So prior to the Shelby's arrival in Fayette County, the land that they would eventually come to occupy was home to numerous native peoples. Few records survive to tell the stories of these original inhabitants, though numerous burial mounds once dotted this landscape, standing out, quote, like finger posts pointing backwards across the bygone centuries. Many of these mounds were leveled over the course of the 19th and 20th century, but it was said that they contained, quote, large quantities of Native American relics. Tradition also describes this land as having been home to, quote, rival native tribes drawn to the area by 2 perennial springs. Early archaeological discoveries, including, quote, many implements, arms, and relics of the Indians found on the site, suggest that a battle may have occurred on the tract. Whether the conflict was between indigenous groups or indigenous groups and white settlers is unknown. Many legends circulate regarding the Shelby's acquisition of their lands in Fayette County. One tale claims that Governor Shelby exchanged with Native Americans a rifle and a pony for the entire 3,000-acre tract, while another suggests he traded a flintlock rifle with a Revolutionary War veteran for 1,000 acres. These stories, though captivating, are untrue. The factual account is less dramatic. Although captivating, these stories are untrue, and they may have contributed to the occasional reference to the tract as Governor Shelby's purchase. The factual account is less dramatic. The Shelbys received their lands in Fayette County as compensation for military service. The tract encompassed 3 distinct surveys, one patented to Governor Isaac Shelby, one to General Evan Shelby, and one to James Shelby. Following the death of Governor Shelby's father, Evan, and brother James during the Native American raid to Crab Orchard Springs, Governor Shelby inherited the entirety of the tract, which encompassed some of the finest and most fertile land in the Bluegrass region. Few records survive detailing Shelby's early ownership of the tract, but one enduring story persists. Isaac Shelby was once seen blazing trees, marking the boundaries of his land with axe cuts, a common method of surveying during the frontier era. And here's a couple visuals. So there's no known images of the burial of the Native American mounds that are on the property, but this is a map that was found on the north end of town, and this map shows some early Native American trails, and one of them ran straight through the tract just about where Old Richland Road is now. So during the early years of Governor Shelby's ownership of the tract, the Shelbys seem to have had little involvement with their Fayette County holdings. Their primary focus remained in Lincoln County, where Governor Shelby had firmly established himself. There he acquired 10,000 acres, which was part of the first land grant granted in Kentucky. According to local legend, Shelby was led to the site while pursuing a buffalo to supply meat for the garrison of Fort Boonesborough. In 1786, upon this tract, he completed a stone residence which he dubbed Traveler's Rest. Here, Governor Shelby and his wife Susanna, a daughter of Captain Nathaniel Hart, an early surveyor, began to grow their family, ultimately having 12 children between 1784 and 1804. And that's what Traveler's Rest looked like. The original house burned down in the early 20th century, and on top of the original foundation, they built a colonial revival house. And then there is Susanna Hart Shelby and Governor Shelby on the left. So as Governor Shelby's sons began to grow up and marry, he sought to establish them on his holdings across the Commonwealth. The first to marry was his eldest son, James Shelby, who married Mary Pendell, daughter of Revolutionary-era surgeon Dr. Richard Pendell, renowned for treating and repeated Lafayette's wounds at the Battle of Brandywine during the Revolution. James and Mary were wed on July 28, 1808. As the eldest and first to marry, James likely had received first choice of his father's holdings. He selected the northern portion of the 2,900-acre Fayette County tract. The southern would go to the governor's third son, Major Thomas Hart Shelby, who did not take up residency there until 1816. The tract remained in Governor Shelby's name, however, until 1824, when he officially deeded and divided the Fayette County property between these two sons. This represented the lion's share of their inheritance. He sold the land to them for the nominal sum of 1 cent each. The division running along an east-west line through the tract officially elevated the brothers to among the largest landowners in the county. And the image on the left is a map which showcases pretty much the entirety of the 3,000 acres. And those are the 6 houses that the family would eventually complete between 1808 and 1860. And the line is just about where that division line would have gone between General James and Major Thomas's property. And then Thomas is here on the right and the general on the left. So soon after their wedding, James Shelby and Mary Pendell took up residency on their portion of the Fayette County holdings. Between 1808 and 1810, they constructed a dwelling, which they named Richland. I'm going to be referring to this home as Richland 1. There's going to be several different iterations of the building that were constructed by the family over time. Architectural investigation conducted during the 1978 National Register application for the Shelby family Fayette County houses concluded that this home was, quote, a brick construction with a central hall and configured as 5 bays wide, 2 rooms deep, and 1.5 stories tall with a basement. A chimney served each room, and fireplaces were located on both floors, end quote. This house was intended only to serve as a temporary residence until James could afford to build a larger and more elaborate home. However, architectural interpretations of Richland 1 suggest it was not an especially modest structure, particularly when compared to other early settlement-era dwellings, which typically consisted of 1 to 2 multi-purpose rooms where families cooked, slept, worked, and entertained. By contrast, Richland 1 appears to have had at least 4 primary rooms on the first floor. And unlike the customary dwellings of the time, it was constructed of brick instead of the more plentiful and practical log option, typical of the first phase home during the frontier era. Notably, James's younger brother, Major Thomas Hart Shelby, resided in a log cabin for 7 years prior to the construction of his grand brick mansion in Grassland. Following James's brief service in the War of 1812, the now General James Shelby, often remembered as, quote, haughty or prideful, end quote, referred to Richland 1 in a letter to his father on April 3rd, 1817 as, quote, a cold, comfortless dwelling I have already too long occupied, end quote. He attributed his inability to build a more elaborate residence to, quote, rogues, runaways, disease, and death, end quote. Despite professing a moral opposition to enslavement, declaring that he, quote, detested slavery from my very heart, end quote, and claimed to be, quote, deterred from never holding another wretch in bondage, end quote, he concluded, quote, without more slaves, I shall never be able to get out of this cold, comfortless dwelling. This sentiment reflects a common conundrum of the era and parallels many of Thomas Jefferson's conflicted views on enslavement. Jefferson famously described slavery as, quote, a hideous blot on the national character, and an evil that contradicts the very principles of the Revolution. Yet he acknowledged the South's economic dependency on the institution. His infamous metaphor, quote, we have the wolf by the ear, and neither can we hold him nor safely let him go, epitomizes the moral and practical tensions many slave owners claim to experience. Despite General James Shelby's stated moral qualms, he continued to expand his reliance upon enslaved labor. Census records show that the numbers of people he held in bondage grew from 20 in the 1810 census to 27 in the 1820. And the number continued to grow exponentially throughout the remainder of his life. The Fayette County tract sustained by the forced labor of enslaved people became for James Shelby a, quote, source of great profit. The labor required to make the land productive, including felling trees, removing stumps, building fences, and preparing pastures, was grueling and unrelenting. It was enslaved individuals who bore the burden of this foundational labor, making the later agricultural success of the property feasible, and ultimately enabling the accumulation of funds that would finance the construction of General James Shelby's Richland II. Sometime in the early 1820s, General James Shelby enlisted Matthew Kennedy, who would later become the first Kentuckian designated the status of professional architect, to design a new home on the northernmost hill of his estate. Kennedy's career had recently been advanced on two major fronts. First, his design for the second state capitol, 1814 to 1816, and second, his design for the Transylvania Main Building in 1816. The latter project proved especially influential and is likely what attracted Shelby to engage Kennedy for his own home. Kennedy produced several renderings for the Transylvania Main Building, one of which was a neoclassical scheme. While this design was ultimately modified in favor of a more traditional style, the neoclassical elements such as the pilaster and pediment treatment found a lasting place in Kennedy's residential work. He adapted these features, translating them into a striking domestic style, which he repeated over a dozen times across the Bluegrass region. And here we have Kennedy on the left, and the lower is his neoclassical design with 6 pilasters and the pediment, and that was redacted into the design up top. And so by late March 1823, the new Richland, which I'll be referring to as Richland II, was noted as, quote, recently built, just as construction of the house of General James Shelby's younger brother, Major Thomas Hart Shelby, was about to commence. Major Shelby had also commissioned Kennedy to design his home, Grassland. In a contract letter for Grassland's construction, the builder, John Craig, described the building's layout, stating 60 feet front by 40 feet back, 2 stories high with a pediment front and columns. As the plan alluded to will show, the style and execution of the work to be the same as General Shelby's house recently built by Matthew Kennedy. Much of Richland II's exterior federal period detailing was stripped away during extensive remodeling in 1860, leaving the original appearance open to speculation. Many of Kennedy's homes, including Grassland, feature colossal order brick pilasters upon the facade that correspond to bay divisions, rise to the roof line, and support a central pediment. The contract letter mentions both a pediment and columns within the same sentence as the Richland-Grassland comparison. At Richland, the columns were likely wooden pilasters affixed to the facade rather than Kennedy's typical laden brick pilasters. Removing the laden pilasters would have been costly and likely left more visible evidence of the removal. This theory is supported by the presence of equally spaced nail fragments between the bays and along the outermost edges of the facade at Richland, thus indicating the presence of both Kennedy's 4 characteristic central pilasters as well as pilasters upon the outermost edges of the facade. The use of wooden rather than brick pilasters would make Richland II an anomaly among contemporary Kennedy houses, but it may have simply been a matter of economy, an attempt to save on the brick pilasters while maintaining the pronounced bay divisions to keep the facade visually appealing. Unlike the pilasters, little evidence remains of Richland's pedimented front. However, in Kennedy's other homes, the pediment consistently spans the innermost 3 bays supported by 4 central pilasters, with open and closed pediment varieties used interchangeably. Kennedy's typical treatment of the tympanum, which is the little space inside the triangle, includes a slightly recessed semi-elliptical fanlight set within a brick blind arch. Several of his later homes instead feature wooden semicircular sunburst lunettes in place of the fanlight. However, Kennedy's earlier examples, dating closer to Richland II's construction, uniformly incorporate the glass fanlight. Further inferences about Richland's II's facade can be drawn from the preserved account book of Major Thomas Hart Shelby, kept during the construction of Grassland. The account book includes several deviations that Major Shelby authorized from the original plan. Among them, quotes the front cornice. This likely accounts for the distinctive stylization of Grassland's cornice, which features elegant egg and dart moldings and modillion blocks extending across the breadth of the facade and continuing up the raven cornice. Among Kennedy's known works, this elaborate cornice treatment is unique to Grassland. Given that this feature seems to have been included at the direct request of Major Thomas Hart Shelby, it's plausible to infer that Richland II's cornice followed Kennedy's more typical standard, a simpler horizontal cornice across the facade, and a raking cornice tracing pediments, likely incorporating great fronts where the pilasters intersected with the cornice. And the right one here is one of Kennedy's later houses with the wooden sunburst, and the left is the typical fanlight. So in terms of external composition, Richland II and Grassland were near inverse examples of one another. Both homes featured block and L layouts. Richland's L projected off the left-hand side, while Grassland's projected off the right. Each house originally included a rear gallery that followed the outline of the original block and L. While the treatment of Richland's gallery post remains unclear, the surviving contract letter for Grassland's construction specifies that the original design there called for, quote, brick pillars capped and finished in a plain, neat manner. These pillars appear to have been modified in execution, replaced with rounded brick posts that survived at Grassland today. It is therefore plausible that Richland II's gallery posts were brick pillars like those originally called for at Grassland. Dimensional comparisons further strengthen the connection between the two homes. Both the main block and original L of Richland II possess dimensions nearly identical to those of Grassland. Each house is a 60-foot wide main block and extends approximately 43 feet deep. This is especially notable given that the Grassland contract initially called for a house that was, quote, 60 feet front by 40 feet back, suggesting that both houses may have been slightly expanded during construction. Internally, the houses begin to diverge more sharply, each representing a distinct variation on the four-room central hall plan. At Richland, the layout features both a central hall and a side hall to the left, which as you can see right there in between the left two parlors. As the plan currently exists, and possibly as originally built, the main central hall remains unobstructed, with the staircase located in the side hall. In contrast, Grassland's central hall is pushed forward to accommodate a transverse back passage, connecting the dining room and the parlor, effectively shrinking the size of the central hall. Richland's unconventional placement of the stair hall facilitates a transition from an unobstructed longitudinal first-story hall to a transverse lateral chamber story, allowing for a more efficient use of space within the upper chamber story. If original, this stair in transverse configuration would make Richland an anomaly among surviving Kennedy houses. Further interpretation of the staircase can be drawn from the Grassland contract, which notes, quote, the style and execution of the work was to be the same as General Shelby's house recently built by Matthew Kennedy, with the addition of a geometric stair. This statement implies that Richland II, General Shelby's house, did not feature a geometric stair. And the plan for Richland that you see on the right, what is inked in black is what was there during the 1820s build, and everything else is what was added on in 1860. Tracing the outline of the L and main block, there was that gallery that was about the same layout as the Grassland one that you see on the left. The Kennedy designed house, which is most similar to Richland II in internal composition, was the Meadows. The Meadows, constructed circa 1831, was the residence of noted turfman Dr. Elijah Warfield. It was there that he, quote, conducted a notable racing establishment, and at the site which produced the horse Lexington, described as the greatest thoroughbred this country had ever seen. The Meadows featured a comparable variation of this side hall adaptation of the four-room central hall plan, found at Richland II. Notably at the Meadows, the side hall provided a convenient entry and a degree of privacy for Dr. Warfield's business partners and guests. It offered direct access to his office from the exterior, circumventing the central hall. As you can see, there's an exterior access there. Further, architectural historian Clay Lancaster described the meadows as, quote, a mate to grassland, claiming that its facade was, quote, originally identical to the front of grassland. This observation further clusters these three Kennedy-designed homes, Richland 2, Grassland, and the Meadows, as part of an interrelated group. While the Meadows appears to have shared an internal composition with Richland, a similar internal composition with Richland 2, its external appearance was originally more in line with that of Grassland. And the eclectic portico that you see on the front of the Meadows, that was added later on during the 1890s. And the Meadows is one of the Kennedy's houses which is no longer around. Torn down in the 1960s, I believe. But following the completion of Richland 2, General James Shelby turned his focus to agriculture and animal breeding, most notably mule breeding and trading. By the mid-1830s, he had become a prominent figure in the field. As his children began to come of age, General Shelby sought to establish them on estates of his own, acquiring land across Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. One such estate, Jennifer Place, was located in Helena, Arkansas, along the fertile banks of the Mississippi River. Intended for his son Lafayette, who was to establish a cotton plantation, a lucrative but labor-intensive crop dependent upon enslaved labor. But it would have significantly bolstered the family's fortune. However, Lafayette quickly abandoned the enterprise and returned to Richland. General Shelby, deeply disapproving, ultimately expelled his son Lafayette from his estate. A rupture that marked the beginning of a downward spiral for Lafayette, descending into alcoholism. This descent reached its tragic nadir when Lafayette fatally shot a local clerk named Henry Horine for the offense of an ill-perceived glance towards Lafayette over dinner. The ensuing trial garnered national attention and would tarnish the Shelby name for years. General James Shelby enlisted the renowned statesman Henry Clay to defend his son in what would become Clay's final criminal case. Clay's fiery advocation provided enough evidence to result in a mistrial. Lafayette was released on a $10,000 bond with the stipulation that he appear in the fall term of the circuit court. Public outrage, however, was unrelenting. Effigies of the judge and jurors were hung along trees from trees along Main Street, inscribed with accusations of, quote, bribery and perjury. One effigy of the presiding judge bore the damning label, quote, the judge without justice. The public's perception was clear. The Shelby family had wielded its wealth and influence to obstruct justice. Delays plagued the case, attributed to, quote, the excitement of the public mind and difficulty in procuring an impartial jury. It was ultimately postponed to the September 1848 term. The scandal surrounding Lafayette is likely what influenced General James Shelby to rewrite his will in July of 1848, now leaving the entirety of his estate to his son Isaac, who was called Ike, instructing him to distribute portions among his more deserving siblings. The following month, General Shelby traveled to Jennifer Place, now presided over by his daughter Susan and her husband, Colonel William Grayson Carter, namesake of Carter County, Kentucky. During his visit, General Shelby contracted congestive fever. Determined to return to Richland despite his declining state of health, General Shelby made it back to Richland, where local physicians briefly alleviated his symptoms, but it ultimately proved fatal, passing at Richland on August 15, 1848. Ike Shelby, the general's son, now presided over Richland. He inherited not only his father's vast estates across the Bluegrass and Western territories, but also the weight of familial obligations. Chief among these was the pending $10,000 bail bond for Lafayette's court appearance. Adding to his disgrace, following his father's death, Lafayette fled Kentucky, spending the remainder of his life in far-off Texas or California. Lafayette's departure left Ike to shoulder the court's exorbitant financial penalty, which he ultimately paid in March of 1851. The same year, Ike became embroiled in a familial lawsuit filed by his aunt Virginia Breckenridge, the widow of his uncle Alfred Shelby. Following Alfred's death in 1832, Ike's father, General James Shelby, served as one of the executors of his estate, in which capacity he embezzled upwards of $30,000 intended for Alfred's children, diverting money from the estate of their father, Governor Isaac Shelby. As a result, Ike was ordered to repay the staggering sum along with 20 years of accrued interest. Although Ike managed to delay court proceedings for several years, he was ultimately forced to begin repayment. In January of 1854, he mortgaged his expansive Richland estate to William H. Brand, likely in an effort to alleviate the crushing financial burden. The mortgage noted that the farm was, quote, where Shelby now resides. The following month, Ike married Sarah McClure. Whether the couple continued residing in Richland at that point is unclear, given the uncertain future of the estate. In 1855, Ike completed a new residence on the opposite end of his tract, known as Highland Hall. The specific motivations behind its construction remain unclear. It is possible that Ike, fearing the eventual loss of Richland, sought to establish himself at a smaller and more secure home. No known familial correspondence directly referenced the construction of Highland Hall. The only related remark to building comes from a cousin who 15 years earlier wrote the letter, quote, "Cousin Isaac is busy preparing to build. I expect he will then get him a wife." Whether this earlier reference directly pertains to the same structure is uncertain. Likewise, the fate of this original home of Ike's is uncertain. Whether it was simply abandoned or evolved into what became Highland Hall remains unresolved. The only known surviving reference directly linking Ike to building activity is an advertisement which he placed in the Lexington Observer and Reporter in April of 1850, seeking to employ, quote, "a good brick molder to mold and burn 150,000 brick, needed by the middle of the following May." Preserved within the pages of one of Ike Shelby's account books are nearly a dozen rudimentary floor plans, seemingly drawn by Ike himself. These sketches appear to be a combination of observed houses as well as hypothetical designs, representing both urban and suburban house types. The plans largely explore standard or vernacular solutions to common building questions, rather than being based on contemporary architectural builders' guides. Ike's drawings seem to stem directly from the observation and manipulation of built examples. Architectural manuals from the Federal and Greek Revival period offered little in the way of floor plans, instead focusing on, quote, "information on drafting, descriptive geometry, and materials," and were largely aimed towards artisans trained via an apprenticeship system in drafting and surveying. In contrast, Ike's plans reflect more common solutions rather than the refined compositions expected from those of a professional architect. Ike Shelby appears to have occupied a space somewhere between builder, gentleman architect, and professional architect. He seems to have shared the motivations of the gentleman architects, typically members of the American elite who created architectural designs for their own pleasure, and relied on craftspeople to carry out their visions. However, his designs more closely resemble those of the builder. He appears to have lacked formal training in drafting and surveying, skills typically possessed by both professionals and gentlemen amateurs. And his freehand plans suggest that he may have learned to draw through his interaction with builders. Like those builders, Ike favored those vernacular or practical approaches to spatial organization, employing familial patterns such as central halls, service wings, and block and L layouts. These plans lead credence to the theory that Ike may have designed Highland Hall himself, in collaboration with a local builder. The house reflects characteristics common to other late Greek Revival homes in the region, including the substitution of rounded columns for the cheaper square brick piers. A feature also seen at Bel Air, the home of Ike's cousin, Thomas Hart Shelby Jr., constructed in 1852. Highland Hall is notable for, quote, "its looseness in design, blending elements of the Greek Revival and the Italian." Internally, the awkwardly positioned stair hall, pushed behind the left parlor, as well as its awkwardly proportioned woodwork, suggests the hand of an amateur. Additionally, the presence of large ventilation openings in the upper walls offer an unsightly, albeit practical, approach to cross ventilation, further supporting this interpretation. And then the daguerreotype on the left is an image which is believed to be Ike Shelby. In the spring of 1855, Ike joined the banking firm Taylor, Turner & Co. Following the departure of Ulysses Turner, the firm was rebranded as Taylor, Shelby & Co. The business initially flourished, engaging in large-scale land speculation, but ultimately succumbed to the disastrous bank panic of 1857. The panic triggered a run on the bank, leading to its dissolution in November of that same year. Shortly before the bank's collapse, in September of 1857, the bank borrowed $10,000, using Ike's uncle, Major Thomas Hart Shelby of Grassland, as security. Of Ike, it was said, quote, "No man was ever born or raised in Fayette County who had a higher sense of honor. He was kind-hearted, truthful, and just. He enjoyed the respect of the whole community, and having been tried by the severest of tests to which men are ever subjected, he came out with his integrity not only not impaired, but fully recognized, and surrendered his large patrimonial estate to his creditors without the slightest hesitation or cavilling." End quote. In the wake of the bank's failure, Ike offered to his uncle, quote, "as much of his land or said part of it as he may desire." End quote. Ultimately, he ceded to Major Thomas Hart Shelby 505 acres, with the portion which included the Richland house. To satisfy the remaining debts, Ike was also forced to sell off all other remaining portions of his father's Fayette County holdings, including Highland Hall. He spent the remainder of his life in Jessamine County, residing at the home of his wife's family, known as Nettle Ridge. Within the Shelby family history, this event became remembered as, quote, the disruption of General James Shelby's family, the moment when they lost their land, their wealth, and their family home. And that's the logo of the company, and that's an account book that they had that's preserved at the Filson Club. So Major Thomas Hart Shelby, soon after acquiring Richland, would convey it to his daughter and her husband. His daughter, her name was Elizabeth, and her husband was Judge William Bury Kincaid. He said he did this in, quote, consideration for the love and affection which he bears to Elizabeth, who is his daughter, and the future consideration of $20,536, end quote. Major Shelby ultimately subtracted $18,000 for the purchase of Richland from Elizabeth's future inheritance, as well as an additional $11,200 for an adjoining 144 acres he purchased for William and Elizabeth. At the time of this transaction, Judge Kincaid and Elizabeth had been residing in Covington since 1850. For Major Shelby, this move would bring to him his last surviving daughter and bring her back to Fayette County. One of the Shelby nieces described Elizabeth's imminent return as, quote, the best thing that could happen to Uncle Tom, as his evil genius whiskey had gotten the upper hand of him since Mary's death in 1856. And Elizabeth will be better able to control him. And we have Judge Kincaid on the left, Major Thomas Shelby in the middle, and Elizabeth on the right. Major Thomas Hart. After acquiring Richland, the Kincaids began planning significant upgrades and additions to the house. They enlisted renowned architect John McMurtry to draft plans for the redesign and hired Henderson and Long, a building and contracting company that operated the Kentucky Planing Mill in Covington, to oversee the construction and provide the architectural millwork. Further, extensive teams of craftspeople were brought in from the Cincinnati area to oversee the various aspects of the redesign. In early spring 1860, McMurtry submitted his plans, charging over $100, a cost that Kincaid deemed exorbitant. Frustrated, he wrote to his father-in-law stating, "McMurtry has sent me a most extravagant bill for his work as architect. I have already paid him considerably over $100. I understand I could have had it done here for $50. I will not pay him another cent. I will have nothing more to do with him." Just a few weeks later, Kincaid would state, quote, "We abandon in great measure McMurtry's plans. It is too costly." Yet, as construction progressed, Kincaid still refers to numerous elements as part of McMurtry's layout, suggesting that they maintained the core of McMurtry's plans while abandoning some of the additional ornamentation. Further, many of the internal and external additions and configurations closely resemble elements of some of McMurtry's finest regional homes. And so you see up in the top right, that ad is for the roofer, and I found that in the attic. And on the back of it, it says, given to Major Thomas Hart Shelby for Judge Kincaid, 1860. And that's an ad for William Dunn, who was in Covington, but he came down to put the roof on Lexington, at the house in Lexington. And on the leftmost, that is an ad for the Kentucky Planing Mill, which was in Covington, and then McMurtry's in the middle there. So key changes they made to the house, including extending the main block upward by several feet to create a low third story, transforming the original attic space into a fully livable area. This alteration also changed the roof configuration from a side gable to a low-rise hip configuration, giving the home an appearance described as, quote, a colossal cube. Crowning the new roof line, an elegant widow's walk was added. Additionally, the rear service L was extended, and a large banqueting hall with soaring 16-foot ceilings was added at the interior angle of the original block and L. Within the main block, the former double parlor, previously divided by wall partitions and pocket doors, was reconfigured, with the space now separated by a Tower of the Wind's column screen. Throughout the main block, ornamental plasterwork, large-scale Italian woodwork, and several cast-iron Italian mantels were installed, and that's the capital of one of the Tower of the Wind's columns. Externally, the east porch and rear western veranda gallery were removed. The east porch was replaced with a large veranda, while a tetra-style Corinthian portico was added at the entryway on the north. Additionally, the northern and southern first-story windows were cut down to the floor level, and their original jack arches were concealed with intricate metal hood moldings. Finally, a thick coating of paint was added across the entire exterior, masking many of the blemishes caused during the house's extensive reworking. These extensive 6-month-long renovations were overseen primarily by Major Thomas Hart Shelby, as the Kincaids were still residing in Covington. By late November 1860, the Kincaid family were able to move into their newly transformed Richland, which I'll be referring to as Richland 3. Richland's metamorphosis extended beyond the main residence, incorporating significant embellishments to the grounds and their formal layout. These changes continued for several years after the Kincaid's arrival and aligned with the picturesque movement, popularized in the United States by landscape architect and horticulturalist Andrew Jackson Downing. Downing's treatise on the theory and practice of landscape gardening in North America emphasized that, quote, architectural beauty must be considered conjointly with the beauty of the landscape or situation. Downing's influence extended nationally, but his ideas had a particular interest in the bluegrass region. Among Downing's Kentucky followers, John McMurtry was the most ardent, constructing several residences between the 1850s and 1860s, which drew directly from Downing's designs. Downing classified American country estates into 4 distinct categories based on the scale of the residence and the ornamentation of the grounds, these being the cottage residence, the ornamented farm, the villa, and the mansion. The alterations made to Richland align with Downing's highest classification, the mansion, which he described as, quote, distinguished by the extent of its grounds, which include not only large farm tracts with their appropriate buildings, gardens and pleasure grounds, but a wide and extensive park, covered with grass and beautified with numerous scattered groves, groups, and masses of trees. In the midst of which stands a dwelling, a large and architectural edifice. In keeping with Downing's naturalist ideas, many modifications made to the residence sought to integrate the structure with its surrounding landscape. One of Downing's chief criticisms of earlier buildings was the abrupt termination of architectural beauty at the base of the residence, lacking any organic connection to the environment. Downing's treatise outlines several methods to rectify this issue, both in new construction and in modifying older buildings. At Richland 3, alterations were made to engage the home on 3 fronts. The addition of the large portico on the north, the large portico and terrace on the north, visually extend the structure into the landscape, while the floor-to-ceiling windows allowed residents to transition fluidly from the built environment to the natural surroundings without actually fully stepping out onto the grounds. The eastern elevation became a semi-outdoor living space, tracing the outline of the deep 6-bay gallery, which is the elongated side that you see, with the northern portion sheltered by a large veranda, while the southern was enhanced with the inclusion of a spacious brick patio. Additionally, the western elevation engaged with the landscape through a large bay window in the banqueting room, which offered views of much of the beautified grounds. This was complemented by a smaller western porch. Meanwhile, the southern elevation remained largely visually concealed and was designated primarily to service functions. So the internal composition of Richland 3 also aligns with the picturesque movement, closely resembling elements of regional homes with connections to the 2 most prominent romantic architects of the period, those being Downing and Alexander Jackson Davis. At the junction of the main block and original L, the Kincaids added their grand banqueting hall, which closely resembles the drawing room in Plan No. 2 of Loudon, designed by Davis and built by McMurtry in 1850. Both rooms shared some similar layouts, with the fireplace and bay windows symmetrically centered along the room's shorter axis, as well as nearly identical dimensions of 17 by 28. However, the Loudon drawing room as built was later enhanced to 20 by 30, and that is the Plan No. 2, and you'll see the drawing room that is right there. Additionally, the preliminary plan for Loudon featured an elongated L-shaped corridor. The wider, shorter stem of the L accommodated public circulation between the hall and the parlor, while the longer, narrower passage facilitated service circulation. A similar L-shaped corridor outlines the banqueting hall at Richland 3. I'll show you. You can see the L-shape tracing the bay window room. Here, the shorter section provided public circulation from the main hall to the banqueting hall, while the longer, narrower passage allowed service access from the kitchen and pantry. This L-shaped hall spatially divided the banqueting hall from the rest of the residence. Architectural historian Clay Lancaster described the room as, quote, a separate pavilion. Further, the entry sequence at Richland 3, a long, unobstructed, shadowy hallway, concluding at the brilliantly lit banqueting room, resembles the hallway library of the Ely Villa, built by John McMurtry in 1851 and designed after Downing's Design 26, quote, a country house in the pointed style. However, at Richland, the bay window is turned to the right at a right angle to engage with the western landscape. Additionally, the placement of Richland 3 stair hall in its longitudinal to lateral spatial progression parallels those of the Ely Villa, features that would have been anomalies if they dated to Matthew Kennedy's 1820s Richland 2. And you'll note the unobstructed central hall here at the Ely Villa, and about halfway you'll see a side hall that makes a T shape with the main block and L, which is where the staircase is. And you see basically the same thing at Richland with the elongated central hall and the T-shaped hall on the left, and then the longitudinal to lateral spatial progression. Surrounding Richland's engaged elevations was a 16-acre lawn planted with numerous large groups and masses of large oak and walnut trees, along with many beautiful and ornamental trees and evergreens. In addition to this verdant landscape, the estate featured a, quote, garden of nearly 2 acres with a great arbor extending through it, containing an abundance of fruit trees, including pears, cherries, and an apple and peach orchard of nearly 15 acres, end quote. To further enhance these grounds, Judge Kincaid enlisted the expertise of Francis Xavier Hillenmeyer, one of the Bluegrass region's foremost arborists. Hillenmeyer assisted in the selection and cultivation of the gardens, vineyards, and trees. Scattered across these pleasure grounds, the Kincaids altered earlier vernacular farm buildings to contribute to the state's picturesque aesthetic. Aligning with Downing's principles of unity in design, they modified these outbuildings to reflect various elements of the main residence. The most notable example, the octagonal ice house, featured elegant Italian brackets identical to those of the new veranda, and was crowned with a classical finial at its peak. This transformation gave the ice house the appearance of a rustic garden pavilion placed into the picturesque setting, and is reminiscent of numerous designs put forward by Downing. And the left is one of the designs that Downing put forward in his magazine called The Horticulturalist. So Judge Kincaid also engaged the expertise of landscape architect and horticulturalist Charles Xavier Bell, who was the first superintendent of the Lexington Cemetery, which was laid out according to numerous Downing-esque ideas. Bell was brought on to, quote, advise with us, the Kincaids, as to the improvement and running up of our roads. He ultimately consulted on the formal layout of the approach, as well as the selection of plant life and shrubbery to frame the background conveyances. The final arrangement of the paths, roads, and walkways served to cohesively unify the various aspects of the picturesque landscape. The most notable of these features was the main approach, constructed in what's called the macadamized fashion, which is basically super tightly pressed down gravel. This road, which largely retains its Kincaid-era form, extends from the public thoroughfare, winding around the grounds in gradual sweeping bends. This design was favored by Downing, allowing visitors to appreciate both the vastness of the landscape and multiple vistas of the main residence, rather than viewing only a primary architectural facade via a linear drive. And Downing observed that this design gave a more complete size and character or elegance of building. This approach culminated in a full circle around the main residence before concluding at the rear southern elevation where the stables and carriage house were located. Judge Kincaid invested extensively in the embellishments and rebuilding of Richland, confident that large-scale agricultural and animal breeding would offset the expense. At times, he maintained over 400 acres in active cultivation, with large portions of the land dedicated to hemp production. Hemp had long been one of Central Kentucky's most lucrative cash crops. In 1848, over half of the hemp produced in the United States came from Central Kentucky, with the bulk of it originating in bluegrass soil. Hemp cultivation was exceptionally labor-intensive. In Kentucky, overwhelmingly performed by enslaved people. The prevailing sentiment of the time, was that the labor was, quote, very dirty and so laborious that scarcely any white man would work at it, end quote. At Richland, enslaved men were involved in every aspect of the cultivation process, including clearing and preparing the land, seeding, cutting, stacking into shocks, breaking, hackling, and baling. While hemp is widely recognized as having been a labor-intensive crop, enslaved men are rarely credited with this level of skill required to cultivate it successfully. Moreover, much of the craftsmanship associated with aspects of the hemp-producing process is often overlooked.
Among the enslaved men at Richland, one was named George Washington, known not only for his intellect, but also for his exceptional craftsmanship. He constructed a rope walk on the property, which, quote, supplied the farm with a superabundance of raw rope. And he was remembered as, quote, a marvelous genius and gifted artisan. Many of the enslaved women at Richland managed tasks directly relating to the running of the household, including cleaning, cooking, and caring for the young Kincaid children. One such woman was named Amy, who was purchased sometime between 1850 and 1853. She developed especially close bonds with the Kincaid children that she helped care for. One of these children was Judge George Blackbird Kincaid. Later he recalled of her, quote, "She seemed to understand me better than anyone else, and certainly I felt she loved me most." And, quote, "This great love I bore to her clung to me to the day of her death, and nothing delighted me more than to do something that I thought that would make her happy." Little is known of Amy outside of these fragments. She was a mother with a son named Tom, and who appears to have been enslaved by Judge William Bury Kincaid's brother, George Blackburn Kincaid. On December 30th, 1865, all of the formerly enslaved people at Richland left except for Amy, who remained with the Kincaid family until her death. Judge George Blackburn Kincaid was by her side when she died, an event he recalls as occurring during a summer visit home from Princeton. He remembered, quote, "As the end approached, I stood by her side, reading to her from the Bible such passages as she desired, and holding her hand clasped in mine, I watched the shadows lengthen till darkness and despair enveloped me." And the bottom right image is basically what hemp looks like after it's been cut. And hemp has about a 120-day growth cycle. It grows in canes up to about 13 to 15 feet tall, after which you leave it out through a process called retting or dew rotting, which is basically let it break up a bit and make it easier to work with, so you can take it through a hemp break and bust it open to get to the fibers within, which are then fackled, then put through a rope walk and spun into rope for industrial purposes. Judge Kincaid never fully recouped the money that he invested in the remodeling at Richland, with unfortunate timing completing the home within 6 months of the beginning of the Civil War. Situated just off the main road between Lexington and Richmond, Richland became a nexus for Union and Confederate forces alike. Judge Kincaid, an ardent member of the Democratic Union Party, hoped to maintain the status quo, preserve the Union, and maintain slavery, though he remarked that he would, quote, "try to do all I can to aid anyone who is in trouble, no matter on which side," end quote. Before the war, the Kincaids and Shelbys had been among the wealthiest landowners in the county. Yet following the war's end, their finances tied to the cultivation of the land and reliant upon enslaved labor had been devastated. By 1874, Judge Kincaid had amassed substantial debts, and he could no longer maintain the vast and costly Richland estate. William and Elizabeth's son, Judge George Blackburn Kincaid, would recall, quote, "My people were reputed wealthy. My father and my mother's families held the dignified position of being accounted among the largest landowners in their county. They were neither unusually extravagant in their family nor reckless in their ventures. How their fortunes evaporated, it would now be profitless to recount. Suffice it to say they did. They disappeared, and there is no benefit in repining. They dealt honestly, every creditor received his due, and my mother came nobly forward and voluntarily surrendered her patrimony, to which the law could not possibly have reached. I honor her for this, and though it reduced her from affluence to penury, it left us all in a position in which we could look the whole world in the face without exciting a blush." The sale of Richland in September of 1874 marked the end of a half-century of Shelby tenure. It was remembered, quote, "when their estates passed from their original owners and fell into the hands of those who cut down the splendid forest trees, plowed up the bluegrass sod, and planted it in tobacco, the lands may become enhanced in commercial value, but their beauty was gone." Over the next century, ownership of Richland transitioned between three families: the Scotts, 1874 to 1898, the Lands, 1898 to 1970, and finally the Francis family, 1970 to present. During this time, Richland hosted many of Fayette County's social elite. The Scotts, prominent owners of a large rope walk and bagging manufactory in Lexington, brought both industry and status to the property. The Lands, another affluent family, expanded their holdings significantly, acquiring the neighboring Shelby estates, Grassland and Rumont, amassing nearly 2,000 acres. By the mid-20th century, however, Richland had fallen into neglect. The Land family no longer lived on the property full-time, using it primarily as a satellite tobacco farm. Many of the outbuildings deteriorated and were eventually demolished, while the house itself entered a state of disrepair. In 1970, Arthur and Ruth Francis purchased the property. Tragically, a fire in 1982 severely damaged the main block of the house, delaying restoration efforts for decades. Yet, despite this devastating setback Richland endured, The blaze, while destructive, unveiled many elements of Matthew Kennedy's original 1820s design. This tragedy provides an opportunity for renewed documentation and further study, deepening the understanding of Richland's architectural significance, an outcome similar to the insights gained after the 1987 fire at Latrobe's Pope Villa. Richland exemplifies the evolution of architectural expression in Kentucky. From Matthew Kennedy's 1820s federal temple front design to John McMurtry's later Italian embellishments. This dual architectural legacy makes Richland uniquely significant, offering insights into shifting stylistic trends and the increasing embrace of wealth and grandeur in the mid-19th century. Beyond its individual significance, Richland's stylistic evolution connects it with some of Central Kentucky's most notable buildings, while also linking it to influential national architects such as Alexander Jackson Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing. Its transformation over time reflect not only the personal aspirations of the Shelby and Kincaid family, but also the broader diffusion of architectural and landscape trends across the United States. As a rare surviving and well-documented example of a home which blends both federal and Italian influences while embracing picturesque landscape principles, Richland stands as a key of Kentucky's built heritage. By recognizing and documenting its evolution, we ensure its lasting place in the study of American architectural history and deepen our understanding of how wealth, taste, and design intersect in the mid-19th century bluegrass landscape. Thank you.
And you'll see the top left right there, that is the left image in the parallel is around 1906, and the right is less than 30 years later, and the ice house was torn down within 5 years of that image. So, do we have any questions?
Which of these buildings are still around?
Let me go back to this. So you'll see there's 6 houses that are marked out on this map. Those are the 6 Fayette County Shelby houses that were on that 3,000 original acres. Of the 6, only Rumont is gone, and Rumont's the one that's right below the line. And Rumont was the smallest of the houses. It was meant to be only kind of an intermediate house, and the man who built it was one of Major Thomas Hart Shelby's sons. And he built it before he proposed to a woman who wanted to marry, and she said no. And he said he was going to be a bachelor for the rest of his life after that. So he never moved out of the house. And in the 1920s, it got added onto in some bad, craftsman style additions, and then burned in the 80s and was torn down. But all the other ones are still around.
So, I'm sorry, I can't read this very well, so do you mind just to walk over and point out the roads and the structures?
So that is Old Richmond Road, Jacks Creek, Shelby Lane.
Okay.
So the oldest of the houses, which was Richland 1, constructed between 1808 and 1810, it was right here. Pieces of it still survive. In the 1840s, well, after General Shelby built his new house, Richland 2, in the 1820s, he moved there and pretty much abandoned the original house. In the 1840s, he gave what was left of it to his youngest son, Evan. And Evan also hired I believe it was John McMurtry, to redo it into what became Greenfield. And really, there's not much left of what was Richland 1 except for one rear wall, which I think showcases that just what it was used for in between 1820 and 1840 was probably nothing if it was in such bad condition by 1840 that only one rear wall was able to be reused. And then this is Grassland, 1823, Major Thomas Hart Shelby. And then this was Major Thomas Hart Shelby's son, Thomas Jr.'s house, completed in 1852. And then this is General James Shelby's son's house, Highland, and that was 1855. And then there's Rumont again.
And so the thick black line is a division between inherited properties.
It's basically, so Governor Shelby owned the whole thing, the whole nearly 3,000 acres. And the line is just about where he divided it between those two sons. And there were other children. The governor had 12 children, and a lot of them lived into adulthood. All the other sons remained in Lincoln County. And they, the plot that the governor had there, he divided it between them. Isaac Jr., the governor's son, had a house called Arcadia. There was also Knightland. And the governor's youngest son, Alfred, inherited Travelers itself.
Very back?
You had mentioned the ad that you found in the attic.
Yes.
Were there other treasures that you found up there that has enriched your study?
So the main attic portion burned, but so I'll show you where everything that was above the main block burned. Everything that was above the L's didn't burn. I found that ad above this room. And I also found some scraps of wallpaper, most of that being 20th century stuff. And I've saved it all, but the ad's really the only really special thing that I found.
Something to do about funeral house at Shelby. You have
The coin?
the metal.
Yes.
Do you know what the original one of that is?
I do not. I know that later on it was originally gold, and in the later 19th century, copies of it were made in gold, bronze, and silver. And you see those around every once in a while, but no, I don't know what the original is.
There was a copy at Waveland at one time, but it's not.
There's a house, is it Elsley? Was it the Elsley house? Was it ELL? Is it still standing?
Yes, it's on Linden Walk. Linden Walk. It's Dr. Birchfield's house.
In Lexington?
Yes.
Off North Broadway?
No, it's near campus.
Okay.
So Lafayette Shelby, the scoundrel that ran away, did he, you say he got to Texas? Or
In California. There's a couple of different Lafayettes that pop up. There's a Lafayette that pops up enlisted as a Confederate during the Civil War. There's a Lafayette that pops up on some deeds in Texas and then later on in California. And there's also a person who made a YouTube video making some really weird claims without any evidence backing it up. But he claimed that they were in Missouri and he got killed by a bushwhacker. And I asked him, do you have anything that backs it up? And he said, I saw it online. It's got to be true.
I know there's spelling different, but Kincaid is that?
Garvis.
Garvis?
Well, if you go way back to Scotland, they're from the same branch, but the Kincaid EA spelling is the newer. That branched off about 300 years ago. If you go way back, same lines, but.
Having seen the house,
Which one?
yours, the Richmond, and seeing the burnt area,
Oh.
you're continuing single-handedly to try and renovate.
Piecemeal. The biggest room in the house is. So the banqueting hall, a couple years ago we redid that, and that took an entire summer, and we're really thrilled with it. So over the years we're hoping to do piecemeal it, but nothing any big at any one time. And the neatest thing I found in that room is above one of the window, the room has 16-foot ceilings, and the window trim is 12 feet tall in itself. And so while we were on the scaffolding and cleaning it off, I was wiping down the instead part of the trim, and I found a note written into the wood, and it said, I papered this whole house, W.P. Dale, 1860.
You need to leave your own sign.
Yeah.
Well, what a fascinating and well-presented talk. That's all. The next one is September the 9th, and it's Dr. Mel Hankler, and he's going to talk about early pioneer life in Kentucky using artifacts. And he's a doctor, and he's with the worked for 23 years with the Kentucky Humanities. So thank you for coming. Just one other thing you have to do.
There's supposed to be a name on it.